Welcome, everyone, to the Glendale's Parks, Recreation, and Community Services special meeting for today, Monday, December 14, 2015. Roll call, please.
Commissioners Asatrian?
Present.
Wad?
Here.
Galfayan?
Yes.
Michaels?
Here.
President Wu?
Present.
The agenda for the December 14, 2015 special meeting was posted on the bulletin board outside City Hall on or before Friday, December 11, 2015. Item 2, upcoming council agenda items.
President Wu, at this time, we do not have anything scheduled for City Council report within the next 4 weeks. So that's it.
Okay, item 3,
Please.
commission staff comments.
I'll take the opportunity to wish our audience, our viewers, special holidays and season greetings. And I want to remind you, when you're shopping, please remember the needy children in our community. And I'm sure the fire department has a special collection agency. The police department has a special place to, they call it Cops for Kids and Sparks for Love toy drive. Plus, remember them when you're shopping. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just had a question. I wonder if staff could sort of review quickly what the council did with the $16 million funds that the Parks Commission or the Parks Department has to spend.
Yes, President Wu, members of the commission. Last Tuesday night, we did have an agenda item on the City Council calendar, which was an action item to review and approve a proposed development impact fee strategic plan, and it was the same plan that we had submitted to the commission last month, comprised of Tier 1 projects and Tier 2 projects, and it was a very healthy discussion on the part of the City Council. In the final analysis, I thought we got pretty good consensus on the council's interest in using the funds to develop a soccer field, to try to develop a project to add a soccer field, whether it's working in partnership with the Glendale Unified School District or to add a soccer field to an existing park, such as Verdugo, or for a period of time, the Mayor's Park was being discussed as a potential location to add a soccer field. We did report that we would be adding a soccer field as part of the Fremont Park master plan, and that there was potential to add a additional soccer field play at the sports complex by converting a natural turf baseball field into an artificial turf, a dual-purpose field that could be used for baseball during the baseball season and then soccer during the non-baseball season. I think there was consensus to use all of the DIF funding from this point forward to projects that would benefit southern and central Glendale parks, as opposed to other areas of the city. There was a lot of discussion on the continued use of the development impact fee funds for the Duke-Majan Wilderness Park. I'm not sure we had a consensus on that, so we will be going back to City Council in late January or early February with a refined plan with more specific projects identified by staff and for further final direction on the plan. The council felt, I believe we had consensus to go ahead and add new amenities into existing parks, such as shade structures, such as restrooms. For example, Wilson Mini Park was identified, and I think we got pretty clear direction on that park for a restroom, to add more outdoor play equipment to our parks and playgrounds. There's interest in adding new and different playgrounds in our parks, and again, these would all be parks located in central and southern Glendale. And then for Tier 2, I think the consensus we got was rather than a Tier 1 and Tier 2 plan to just make them all Tier 1. And if we feel that there's an opportunity to develop a soccer field, to go ahead and attempt to do it as a Tier 1 project, something that we can do within the next 3 or 4 years, instead of putting it out too far in the future. So this happened last Tuesday night. We're still processing and digesting that on staff's part, and so we're going to be working on a refined plan to go back to the council and get a final decision on that strategic plan, which will be timely because it'll be right before the budget plan, the city's budget planning process. So that's the way it works.
What about, we had this notion that maybe use some of the funds to acquire new land, maybe around the central business district. Did that come up? How did that fare?
Yes. I would be remiss if I didn't mention a lot of support for Central Park to develop and improve Central Park. There were some comments about also seeing if we can't use some of the funds to develop a brand new park altogether and acquiring some land to add a new park to our system. So again, we need some time to formalize the ideas and the feedback that we received from City Council and to go back with them with more specific ideas for them to review.
Will the refined plan be coming to this commission and then going to the council, or it'll just be going directly to the council?
We should be able to provide a draft of the plan to this commission. Yeah, we will. That will be our plan.
Thank you.
Next item, please.
The President Wu, members of the commission, if I may, I'd like to go through a few calendar items that we have coming up.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Thank you. On Thursday, December 17th, 5:30 p.m. to 8 p.m., we have the Club Maple Holiday Party at Maple Park Community Center. On Friday, December 18th, 5:30 p.m. to 10 p.m., we have a tea night out at Pacific Community Center. On Saturday, December 19th, 6 p.m. to 9 p.m., the Glendale Historical Society is offering candlelight tours at the Doctor's House Museum in Brand Park. Sunday, December 20th, 12 p.m. to 3 p.m., there's a holiday tea in Japan Culture Day at Brand Japanese Garden. On Friday, January 1st, 5:30 p.m. to 10 p.m., a tea night out at Pacific Community Center, and another tea night out on January 15th at the same time. Saturday, January 16th, will be the last day for people to register for winter lifelong learning classes. And Monday, January 25th, we're back here for another special meeting of the Parks Commission. And just as a reminder, the regularly scheduled meeting for January was canceled. Thank you.
Thank you. Next item, please.
Sure. Next item is 4, oral communications, and I don't have any cards. Item 5, consent items. At A, approval of the minutes of the Commission regular meeting held on November 16, 2015.
I will move it.
I'll second.
Thank you. Commissioners Asatrian,
Yes.
Quad,
Yes.
Kafayan,
Yes.
Michaels,
Yes.
President Wu.
Yes.
Item 6, action items. At A, suspension policy. This is continued from the November 16, 2015 meeting. At 1 is a motion to review and approve CSP's revised suspension policy titled Enforcement of Rules and Regulations and provide feedback on CSP's rules and regulations.
As President Wu, members of the Commission, thank you for agreeing to continue this agenda item from the November meeting and to making the time for this to schedule this special meeting. This is a very important topic and policy for our department. It is the only action item we have today, and our plan would be to get through this, and with regard to the monthly activity reports that are carried over, or the new ones, we could dispense with an oral presentation since you have the written forms of those reports in your packet. And we can focus and concentrate our time on the suspension policy. I would like to, before I turn this report over to Teresa Alexanian, I do want to mention that this is a policy, a project that we have been working on for several months within the department, and also primarily with the police department and the city attorney's office. It is something new that we feel that we need to try. One of our most fundamental responsibilities is to keep the parks as safe and secure as possible, and that includes the neighbors to the parks. We obviously have a lot of park rules and regulations on how our residents are to use the parks and behave in the parks for everyone's enjoyment. Of course, it's always a challenge to be able to enforce those rules and regulations and to be there when they are being violated. We do have staff at our parks, but mainly only in parks where we have community centers will we have staff, or where we have maintenance yards, we may have staff to help enforce park rules and regulations. For example, Brand, Verdugo, and Fremont, we have maintenance yards, and we would have staff coming in and out of the parks to help monitor the parks. And then that's primarily during business hours. Otherwise, we are dependent on the self-policing good behavior of our park patrons. So in large part, after hours, we do depend heavily on the police department and their patrols to help look after the parks, especially when they're closed and people are not supposed to be in the parks. Not all of our parks are fenced, so they are open. They do close at 10 o'clock. So again, we rely on the police department to help us monitor the parks and patrol the parks. Or sometimes during business hours, we will have park patrons that might get out of hand and exhibit threatening behavior towards some of our park staff, and so we feel that we need a policy where there are immediate consequences for persons that completely disregard the park rules and regulations and spoil it for all of the other park patrons. So what we are doing is we are requesting review and agreement from the Commission with a policy that would allow us to issue an immediate 30-day suspension letter to persons that are committing the most serious, egregious violations of our park rules. We aren't requesting review and approval of the rules themselves, but just the policy that we should be able to issue an immediate suspension letter to these individuals. This suspension policy and the development and enforcement of park rules and regulations is an administrative responsibility of the department, meaning that this action would not necessitate going from here to the City Council for the Council's review and approval. The other thing I want to mention is that once we receive direction from the Commission that you're okay with this new suspension policy, that there are still some details that we need to go and refine with the Police Department and the City Attorney's Office in terms of exactly how we are going to work through these policies and procedures and the communication. But we wanted to make sure that the Commission was comfortable with what we were doing before we have every single detail ironed out. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Ms. Alexanian. We also have our department's attorney, Mike Grant, available to answer questions, and Lieutenant Gilkerson, representing the police department, to help answer questions.
Thank you, Jess. President Wu, members of the Commission, As just mentioned, before you is a motion to review and approve the revised suspension policy, which is titled Enforcement of Rules and Regulations, and it's Exhibit 1 attached in the packet. And the second half is to provide feedback on the department's rules and regulations, which is Exhibit 2, which is attached in your packet. The department welcomes and encourages the use of all of our parks and facilities as resources for social, educational, leisure, and recreational purposes. So we want to welcome all types of users, and our parks are designated for particular uses and intended for use in accordance with the design. We have both quiet and natural settings, and we also have noisy playgrounds and sports fields, which are more active. A visitor whose conduct or behavior is disruptive or incompatible with the intended purpose of the park or facility prevents others from enjoying those facilities. So these rules and regulations are designed to ensure the safety and respect of all people, to ensure the grounds maintenance, protect the department's property, and create an environment that encourages the use of the park and facility for the purpose for which it was designed. As just mentioned, it is a challenge to monitor and enforce the rules and have people take it seriously, because we do not have staff at all of the parks. And so for parks which have staff or community centers, it's easier to enforce because we have eyes and ears. But for parks that don't have staff, it's a bit of a challenge. So we're hoping that with the revised policy, we could also look to the police department in helping us enforce some of these rules, and also being able to discipline the individuals who don't follow the rules, even if there's nobody watching. The department currently does have a set of rules and regs and a suspension policy, so this isn't new to the department. It's just a revision to the existing one, which was, I believe, last approved in '96. The revised suspension policy, which is the enforcement of rules and regs, which is again Exhibit 1, it better defines the progressive levels of discipline. It categorizes the department rules as levels of offense. It provides a tool for PD to help enforce the rules while out on patrol or on a call, or just driving through and being the eyes and ears. And it strengthens the suspension procedures, not leaving room for much of a legal challenge, where right now with the existing policies there might be some challenges. This revised policy helps us strengthen that, so that we're better able to withstand the challenge from a community member. It will give staff, both the department staff and PD, a means to effectively address those that are the most egregious and violators of our park rules. The department's suspension policy authorizes staff to exclude or suspend individuals from using CSP facilities when their activity, conduct, or behavior is incompatible and inconsistent with the rules. In order to establish the various levels of discipline, I have identified various levels of offenses. So looking at the various levels of offenses, each rule or regulation is categorized into a level of offense. So what I have up before you is the enforcement of rules and regs, and these are the various levels of offense and the disciplinary action that would go along with each of those. So the levels of discipline are based on the offense's severity and the number of times it occurs. So if we're looking at, let's say, a level 1 offense, and if you look at Exhibit 2, which is where it lists all the rules and regs, each of the rule is categorized under one of the levels. So a level 1 offense, the first time it is committed, so if we were to look at an example, we can look at the very first example of one of disturbing the patrons, which could be obstructing an entrance or throwing an object or doing something that having their phone, loud music in the community center. So any of those, and I mean there's couple pages worth of level 1 offenses. So the first time that offense occurs, it's a verbal warning or a written. It's a verbal or written warning of immediate removal from the premises. So the supervisor or the staff on site would warn the individual that you're doing something you're not supposed to be doing, so please stop. So that would be their warning. If the conduct doesn't cease and they continue to do whatever it was they were doing, then that would be the second offense because they continue to do that. So the second time that the staff person has to address that individual, it will be an immediate removal from the premises plus a one-day exclusion. So we would tell them, we just gave you a warning. You're not stopping whatever it is you're doing. We are asking you to now leave and don't come back for a day. So that would be the one-day exclusion. The third...
So I'm sorry, just to be clear, so you can have second and maybe third and fourth offenses on the same day?
It could be right. If they continue, they don't stop when you ask them to, it could happen on the same day, or it could be another day. So either or. It could be that you ask them to stop doing whatever it is they were doing that day and they stop, and that's not an issue. But then, the next day they come back and they proceed with that behavior. So now that's still a second offense, whether it's on the same day or within 1 year. So from whenever that warning went out, whatever the offense is. So the third offense would be a 30-day exclusion, the fourth offense would be a 6-month exclusion, and the fifth offense would be a 1-year exclusion. So this is a level 1, same, it doesn't have to be the same conduct, but it could be any level 1. If it happens 5 times, you end up being excluded from the facilities for a year. The suspension is from all facilities except for the Verdugo Job Center. So, if the conduct happens at Maple Park, we suspend them. It would be from Maple Park and all of our other 46 facilities, except for the Verdugo Job Center, because at Verdugo Job Center, the individual might be going to get employment services, and so that's a different facility, and so it wouldn't apply to the Verdugo Job Center. To suspend from one facility, again, it's to deter or prevent the same individual from going to another park or another facility and exercising the same type of behavior. We don't want the same individual to leave Pacific Park and go do the same thing at Maple Park. And again, this is really to help us enforce the rules and address the most egregious types of behaviors that are not acceptable. So, it's to help us address those individuals. The police department, the revised policy, this policy also allows the police department to issue suspension notices. So the police department will have little ticket-sized suspension notices that they will issue out in the parks, and they will issue the notices for, at a minimum, starting at a level 3 offense, which is a 30-day suspension. So the police department isn't going to address the level 1 or level 2 type issues. They're going to look at the level 3, which is a minimum of a 30-day suspension and beyond. So they will issue the suspension on the site, and then the notice will be sent to the administration office. So it'll come back to the Parks Administration Office, where we will review the suspension notice and issue a second notice, which will be issued by the Parks Department, confirming the suspension. So let's say there is an individual at the park that's gambling. So the police department, or let's say they're drunk. They're drunk at the park. It's after 10 o'clock they're there, or even at 9 o'clock and they're there, and they're visibly intoxicated, or they steal property. So if the police department comes, they will issue the 30-day notice, which will then come back to the administration office after the shift is over for that police officer, which will then get recorded in the administration office, and we'll send out a second notice confirming that it is 30 days, because it is progressive discipline. So if that individual was already suspended for 30 days, the second notice is already going to be a 6-month. So it shouldn't be 30 days, it should be 6 months. But the police officer isn't going to do that type of analysis on the field. The goal is to just get that individual out of the park and prevent them from coming back until the administration office has had an opportunity to review and verify what that level of suspension should be. So then we'll send out a second notice, which then says you've been suspended for 6 months, or confirm that yes, your suspension is for 30 days. And that individual will still have the opportunity to appeal should they want to appeal. So there is opportunity for the individual to appeal if they feel like this was not issued in fairness, or it shouldn't be 30 days, or it shouldn't be 6 months, it shouldn't be a year, and they have the opportunity to come back to talk to our director or his designee, who will then review all the facts and issue a final decision, whether it's keeping the suspension at what was issued, or giving them a break, and or, well, I don't think it would be increased at that point, but either keeping it the same or reducing it if, for whatever reason, the facts turn out to be different. Again, the appeals process will give the individual the chance to appeal. This concludes my presentation as far as the layout and the details of the suspension policy. I know we have, Exhibit 2 has a lot of our rules and regulations, so we'll just open it up to questions at this point and take any questions the commission might have.
I had a couple of questions.
Sure.
So 1-day suspension, does that include the day of the offense, or is that the following day? If they commit something on a Thursday, are they banned on Thursday, but they can come back on Friday?
Correct. It's the day that the
day of the offense. And there's no fines in any of this?
There's no fines, not at this time.
And the written notices, are they just handed to the person?
Commissioner Fawad, yes, they are. There is a form that will be filled out. It's not part of your packet, but we do have a notice that will be issued. It will be a handwritten notice. If the individual, because it says verbal warning or written warning. So let's say the supervisor is not on site, it's a staff person who witnesses this. The staff person is not able to issue the suspension notice, the written notice. So they'll give them a warning and a verbal notice to leave the premises, which will then be followed up by a written notice. And the written notice will have the information as to when the conduct occurred, where it was, the reason, and the length of time that they're being suspended.
So I would think it's important that the written notices go to, like, the parents, to the home, so parents are aware of what their child, or if that's the situation, what they're doing. So that's part of the plan.
Yes, Commissioner Fawad. Yes, if it is a minor, the notice will go to the parent. So if the person committing the act is of age, then they will be handed the notice. But if it is a minor, yes, the parent will be contacted and it will be given to the parent. And for a lot of the kids who are at our facilities, like at the community centers, they each have activity cards, so they are registered. So we know the information and we know how to contact them. So we would be able to pull that information and contact the parents.
Are people required to have ID, or they're just sort of the ID will be asked for and they have it or they don't have it, I guess?
If the issue is that within the community centers that everybody has an activity card, but let's say it's out in the park and we obviously don't register everybody who uses our park, we'll ask them for ID or information. If they refuse, then at that point we would have to call PD to help us address it, because we're not going to search the individual for their ID. But at that point, we would need them to provide us their information, because we wouldn't have that information on hand.
And just finally, based on sort of past experience, how many people do you think are going to go through this? Are we talking about dozens, hundreds, 10, over a period of time? Do we have any idea how many people will go through the various levels? Estimate? Well,
right now, as far as the police department, this policy now will allow the police department to help us enforce it, so that will be a new thing. For staff, regular staff that's issuing these, I'll probably defer to maybe Mr. Bulanikin to help at the facilities, because he would probably better be able to tell you how many we've issued in the past based on our current policy.
Yes, thank you, President and members of the Commission. Between 15 to 20, depending on the program. If we suspend, any of the park users 30 days or more, currently we would just issue them a letter signed by Mr. Duran. But in the last year, we've probably given about 15 to 20.
15 to 20 a year.
A year.
So it's a fairly small number.
Very small. Pretty small number for 30 days and up. 30 days or 6 months up to a year. The minor violations, such as if you have a program participant or a teenager misusing equipment, we'll give them a 1 day. That's, pretty small infraction, but something with 30 days, 6 months, or a year, about 15 to 20 people per year.
And obviously, you'll be keeping a record of all of the actions you take under the policy, so going
Yes.
forward, we'll know.
And what would be common would be things like fighting, drinking, smoking, maybe driving your car on the lawn in the park, those types of egregious park violations. And if Lieutenant Gilkerson has an opportunity to speak, he may provide you with a guesstimate based on their current experience while patrolling the parks at night, how many persons he might think that might eventually fall under this new suspension policy. Because what's new about it, Ms. Alexander refers to it as a revised suspension policy. The new part is that now with this, the police officers will be able to issue a 30-day suspension notice on the spot. So someone is caught drinking, smoking in the park at 11 o'clock at night. They're not supposed to be there. They're being loud and boisterous. They can be issued a 30-day suspension notice to leave the park and not come back for 30 days. If they go to a different park the next day, the suspension notice will continue to apply to that park and all of the park facilities for 30 days. Within a couple of days after the issuance of the suspension notice, we will receive a copy of the notice. We will review it, and we will uphold the 30 days, or we will make it a final notice where we've determined that it falls into a level 6, and it's a 1 year or it's a 6 month. But the initial assessment will be by the staff out in the field.
And maybe it's a question for people who are going to enforce it. Is this the kind of thing where if you see it happening, you're going to sort of exercise some leniency if they're cooperative, or what's sort of the sense of how you're going to apply this?
There will always be an element of judgment. Obviously, if based on our observation or our rec leaders or our supervisors, is that it's something by mistake kids are climbing a tree and they're not supposed to, they will be informed that the park rule is you're not supposed to be climbing the tree. You can get hurt. You could fall on someone and hurt them, whatever the case might be. Or I don't know what's another common park rule that people break innocently, if you will. Yeah, innocent breaking or not following of the rules would be a simple verbal warning. If it's an individual that refuses to comply with the rule, let's say smoking, they're totally ignoring us and defying our request to not smoke in the park or put their cigarette out, then maybe our judgment would be to go ahead and exercise this policy. If they put the cigarette out right away and maybe it happens again a month later, then we would probably just continue to give verbal warnings.
Perhaps Officer Gilkerson can talk to how many, we've gotten an estimate of the number of problems that the park staff has dealt with. Is there any estimate the police department has that they have been dealing with outside of this policy, since it would now be combined?
Good afternoon, President Wu and members of the Commission. I'm Lieutenant John Gilkerson. And Commissioner Michaels, I don't have, I would estimate that the amount of suspensions will probably increase significantly because of the things that we will encounter and have the authority to act upon. Most of those things would probably start at the misdemeanor crime level. And so we come across a fair number of those things, particularly during nighttime hours, particularly during the summertime. So I would guesstimate that you'll probably see a significant number, I wouldn't say in the hundreds necessarily, but I would suggest probably higher than the 15 or 20 that the parks currently is dealing with. And I'm sorry, the second part of your question?
The second part, I was just interested in how, with the two metrics of how the system would integrate. Because I understand with police department, you would be going in and addressing specifically issues as far as a crime, not necessarily working under the suspension policy. If you now have the suspension policy as an additional tool, how would that integrate with the parks doing the recording and have the officers be able to have access to that information?
Actually, we've, along with park staff, we've had that conversation of building something like a database to use for that purpose. Most of the things that we come into contact with would probably result in a citation, perhaps an arrest, and the suspension. So our intent is to convey that notice of suspension, say, from a Saturday night to Community Services and Parks as soon as possible through interoffice mail. They receive it, then they can contact the person with the follow-up second notice. There's the process there for an appeal. Then we would have to put that information into a database. And this is where this is the technicality that needs to be worked out. But something that an officer at 2 o'clock in the morning, say at Maple Park, can get the information from our communications center that that person was suspended a week ago on 30 days from Pacific Park. So that is the technical aspect that needs to be worked out. But if with a shared database, something of that nature. Does that answer your question, sir?
I believe so. If you have someone who is committing a misdemeanor in the park drinking after hours, I understand the officer's first goal is to address the problem, and the suspension would follow up afterwards as a means to try and follow that individual. My question is more, once there have been a number of citations or a number of suspensions, is there a way that a warrant could be issued so that an officer would follow up if the suspensions do pile up to where police would take further action? Or how the policies would work after the fact? I understand police want to address the problem. Parks wants to go ahead and record the problem to keep that individual out of the park service and the park system and prevent the disruption. I realize it's an administrative policy that's still going to work out. How do you foresee those two functions working together?
Well, I guess in terms of us and the Parks Department, we're an extension of their authority to suspend people. And so administratively, once that's done, I think our role has kind of come to a conclusion, if I understand your question. However, someone with multiple suspensions and so forth, I don't really see a warrant system going into effect. But I do believe that, what we could do is every time someone violates that 30-day suspension is they're trespassing. And then we have the legal authority to act upon that.
Right. Commissioner Michaels, that's what I was going to say, is that the next step would be for arresting them for trespassing. So if they're not supposed to be at the park, that's their discipline action. So they're suspended. They're not supposed to be in the park. Our goal is to get that behavior outside of the park. So the only thing that I believe PD would do at that point is address it as trespassing if they're back in the park. So if the individual at some point is going to be suspended for a year, so if there's multiple offenses, eventually they'll get to a year, which means they shouldn't be at any of the park's facilities. So if they are at any of the park facilities at that point, it will be trespassing and follow up with an arrest for trespassing. But if the individual is not in the park, which is our goal, then it doesn't matter how many they've accumulated. They could be suspended year after year and not enter a park for 10 years. As long as they're not in the park, it's no longer an issue for us or PD.
Exactly. So that's the importance of interoperable, accessible system that allows us to see at 2 o'clock in the morning that someone was suspended. Even 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock in the morning is a violation anyway to be in the park. But let's say it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon at Pacific Park. We need the ability, which we're working to iron out, to say, to find out that this individual was suspended just last week for 30 days from Maple Park. And that, in that case, becomes a trespass.
And I do understand the need for this and generally support it, but I would like to see if there is a way that some of the metrics, some of the statistics can be included in some of the reports that come back to the Commission so that we can continue to see how large a problem this is, if it's effective, or if we need to review the policy again?
Absolutely. We will need to evaluate the effectiveness of the program in order to continue to implement
It may be like at a specified interval, 6 months. I mean, you can
Right.
tell us.
6 months makes a lot of sense.
I had some questions. It's okay. Can you clarify, earlier you mentioned that if there's no supervisor present, but there's a staffer, then it would basically be a verbal warning followed by a written notice sent home. How's the staff member going to actually, what form, if they don't have the form, how are they obtaining the information of the individual, and what's the process for it being passed on to a supervisor?
Sure. If the supervisor is not on site, the staff person, again, if it's an individual with an activity card, which means it happens within a community center, they're already registered and their information is in our system because they had to sign up for an activity card. So their name, last name, address information is in our system. So if it's an individual that is doing something they're not supposed to be doing at one of the facilities, the centers, then we have that information. So even if the supervisor is not on site, when the supervisor returns, we can then issue that and mail it. So within 2 business days, we'd mail them the notice of suspension or exclusion. If it's an individual that's out in the park and they don't have an activity card, we'd have to ask them for their information. So for example, let's say you were at the park and you were doing something that you weren't doing, I'd have to approach you and ask you for your information. If you refuse to give us your information, then at that point, we'd have to call PD to assist us if it's a major issue. If you just choose to leave, then again, we wouldn't be able to obtain your information to issue the notice, but the next time we see you at the facilities, we could follow up. So there will be some situations, I believe, where we won't be able to get their ID, but unless the police department comes and assists us to obtain their information, we wouldn't be able to issue a notice.
I'm actually referring specifically to the forms that I guess are not going to be available to staff, but will be available to supervisors. So, for example, if I am doing something that I'm not supposed to be doing, there's no supervisor on site, the staff member is there, but is attempting to give that written notice. What are they using if they don't have the to collect information to begin with? Is it a scrap of piece of paper, or is it actually going to be something that the staff are going to be trained on?
The forms will be there, they just can't issue. Commissioner Satrin, the forms will be there, so the staff will have access to the forms themselves. It's just as an employee who's not at the supervisor and above, they wouldn't be able to hand them that form because it needs to be signed off by a supervisor at a minimum. So the form will be there, they'll know what information they need to obtain. Really, it's just their name and address information that we need from the individual, because we have access to our rules and regulations, so we know what rule they've broken. We know how, we'll know how many days that individual needs to be suspended. So all the staff will have access to the form. It's just they won't hand it over to the individual unless there's a supervisor to sign off on it. I hope that helps clarify.
It is. Okay, thank you. And then I think I had a couple of legal things that I wanted to make recommendations on, but I don't know if this is something that you guys can run by the legal department. I know you're referring to on page 4, actually, line F, lying on the floor or furniture. Is there a way that we can specify that so then it's not also affecting individuals that are laying on the grass, for example? I understand that we're talking about specifically on objects and benches and so forth, but to see if we can clarify that language. On line F. On page 5, M2, reserving one or more tables. I understand number 1 under M, but so if there was a birthday party for a 6-year-old, the family wouldn't be able to reserve more than 2 tables at the park. That would be an issue according to this, right?
In this situation, Commissioner Satrin, President Wu, members of the Commission, this would refer to our community centers. So if an individual, if let's say there's an individual who's using a table that's set up, and I could always defer back to our manager, Mr. Bulanikian, for clarification if I'm not getting this correctly. But if we have tables set up and there's an individual who's sitting at one table but has their stuff on another table, they're taking up room, then that's what we mean by reserving. So they can't just be sitting at a facility but saying this is for my belongings.
What you're suggesting is line 1, placing your item on a table that you're not really using. I'm referring to number 2, which says reserving one or more tables. So technically, if I'm at Fremont Park and there are 2 tables next to each other and I want to have a party for my nephew, I'm not allowed technically.
Even reserving one table, you're fine.
Right, or even one. So perhaps we can clarify the language on that, because as it stands now, I don't think it really works.
Would Mr. Grant from the City Attorney's Office be able to shed any additional light to the questions or some concerns that were raised by the commissioners?
Good afternoon, President Wu, Commissioners. As was mentioned earlier by staff, these are really draft rules, and they will be refined and defined in time. I know that the Parks, Mr. Duran was concerned about getting the policy of enforcement in place. And again, yes, we'd be happy to clarify these issues and make the particular rules a little bit more definite. But the idea was to at least have some rules in place, and this is what the staff wanted, and this is what the staff drafted. And any ambiguities we can definitely correct.
And then the last item is on trespassing. I know, is this only applying? This is only applying to parks and facilities, right? Because I wanted to bring up an example by where I live, which is Hoover High School, and I'm not sure how we share that with the city, but I know that there's a lack of, for example, tennis courts and places for individuals to actually walk. So community members actually use the tennis courts and the track field at Hoover High School when the school site is actually closed. I've been seeing that for over 15 years, but it's something that, has kind of become like a community activity. So would that apply to this as well? Because I know there's a lack of it, and that's why people are doing it, and there aren't any issues. I just want to make sure that we're not, creating...
President Wu, Commissioner Satrian, the suspension policy only applies to facilities owned by the City of Glendale, the Community Services and Parks Department. So the school district, the facilities at the school district would not apply to this policy.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
I have one. I assume it's in here somewhere, but I would make it clear in your next version who issues the warnings. Because, sometimes it's police and supervisors, or just supervisors. And it may be in the text somewhere, but if it was maybe part of the chart or somewhere, because there's a lot of passive, they will be issued, but I think it would be helpful to say who can issue them.
Commissioner Fuad, yes, we do have we will look at clarifying it in the rules that will get published online as well, but we do have a procedures document, again, that goes along, that's an internal document for staff which specifies who would be the person issuing it. But yes, we will clarify in the document and the rules and regulations that will be published online, because the rules and regulations will be on our website for the individuals to be able to refer to and see what the department's rules and regs are, which isn't there now, but it will, once it's finalized, it will be published, and we'll make sure to read through, and if it doesn't already specify that, we'll specify who can issue.
And are these offense levels, do they predate this policy, or is this something you've just created, the 5 levels? Is this new, or is this sort of not, this has been in existence before?
We had a version of this before, so it's not totally new. We did have different levels of suspension or disciplinary action.
This is a refinement and improvement of that process?
Correct.
I have a couple questions. Okay. I would like to see if I could ask Lieutenant Gilkerson a couple questions from a law enforcement standpoint. I know that you said that you don't have any specific data or numbers that you could present to us, but from your past experience, like you said, you probably will see an uptick once we get these type of policies in place. At the current time, how many times throughout the day, or especially in the early evening hours, in the late evening hours to early mornings, does the PD patrol the various parks throughout the city? And what has been the more or less your knowledge as to the type of crimes that do take place that you think that with this policy in place that would allow the department, the police department, to be able to enforce it and be able to hopefully kind of be able to address the concerns and the issues ongoing?
President Wu, I'm sorry I didn't bring statistics with me, but anecdotally, excuse me, I would say that, the frequency of patrol depends upon the activity generally in the city. But the parks have been a priority for us for a long time. They've become, again, a priority for us this year. We get a lot, and this comes up in the summertime when law-abiding, legitimate users of the park bring issues to our attention that we may not see. And so we, this year, began to deploy regularly bicycle patrols. And in the summertime, we had them particularly concentrate on the parks for quality of life issues. Those may be smoking, it may be drinking. So the frequency is as available, but the parks are a priority, and they've been that way for quite some time. The bicycle patrols are still out there. They're working during the holiday season more to the downtown commerce area, but they're still out there in the parks. And they have the ability to really move in and move our statistics up, because people don't suspect the police are going to roll in on bicycles. And so they're very good at spotting things. So our activity ticks up during the summertime and when the special patrols are put out there. As to the sort of things that we see, most of them are quality of life sort of things, not necessarily violent. That is, that does happen. But a lot of the drinking, the smoking, the drugs, the things of that nature. The nice thing about being able to act on the Parks Department's behalf is that we can see an immediate effect even if we don't arrest someone. So if you have proper identification and you've got an open container, let's say you have drugs, which is very common, we can give you a citation and take your drugs and send you on your way. But if you don't want to be on your way, we don't have a way to have you move. Now we have this system where we can suspend them immediately and hopefully alleviate some of the unpleasantness in the park for the law-abiding park users who really care about the status in their parks and the safety of it, and they want to be able to enjoy them in the city. So,
I was recently at a meeting this past Friday, and one of the community members had mentioned to me that she observes and witnesses a lot of teenagers and youth congregating at the Montrose Community Park, in particular in the upper parking lot area, and they're probably engaged in some illegal activities such as doing drugs and what have you. So hoping that this will give an additional enforcement arm to the police department to be able to kind of address that issue so it doesn't become a negative impact quality of life or to the residents and to the people that are patronizing the park. To see those type of activities being carried on by our youth, it's kind of upsetting.
Yeah, absolutely. When we there's the push down and pop up effect when we go to a park, say Montrose Park, and we really get in there and with very little tolerance for bad behavior, they may leave and then make their way over to another park. The nice thing about this is that you're suspended from parks for a period of whatever ultimately is determined. But that's one of the nice effects of it. And so that's one of the things we deal with. It's generational. That park in particular has some great out of the way places to congregate and drink or smoke or what have you. So, but we do, the parks to us are just natural gathering places for problems, particularly late at night, early in the morning. People can go there and it's closed and it's a place to sneak off to. So we do encounter problems, but we do pay that attention to them.
What are we achieving if we get a drug addict out of the park? Where are we heading them to? How are we helping them?
Well, Commissioner Calfein, I guess I would say that there are resources for the drug addicts. Getting them out of the park, I think, takes them away from the neighborhood people, the neighborhood children. There are certainly resources available to them. If they were homeless, for instance, there are resources available. They could go back home. I don't mean to be callous because I realize it's a problem that needs to be dealt with right down to an individual basis. But I don't think the park is the place for them necessarily with the public access. And taking them out of the park for their drugs or suspending them for their drugs is probably the least that we do. They're probably going to be arrested or at least cited out to appear later on in court. And then, of course, the legal system can hopefully help with diversion. But
We have to fight for it, yeah.
no, I know. It's one of our challenges.
Thank you, Lieutenant. I had one quick question for Mr. Grant, if I may. I think Commissioner Michael had kind of asked this question, and I'm trying to see if I can maybe kind of piggyback off his question. Like, if an individual does get a suspension, let's say for 30 days, and they are on that particular park where they received a suspension for 30 days prior to the 30-day expiration, how is it that, I mean, do they have any legal ramification from a city attorney standpoint where they could be prosecuted in a legal sense, or and then once the 30 days is expired, do they receive any notices that says that now you've satisfied the 30 days and then now the park will go ahead and say that you're okay, you're welcome to be back on the park?
To answer your first question, President Wu, definitely under the municipal code we can file trespassing violations so that if they return, whether it's 5 days or within the 30-day period, our office can file a complaint, or it could be through a citation through the police officer where they have a notice to appear for trespassing. On the second part, the form that you don't have in front of you, which I've worked with the library department, and this whole procedures and everything that's been presented to you today has worked very well in the library department for violations inside and outside the library. But the form that they have, there's a specific box says that the second notice that was referred to, it says the start date is this, the ending date is this, so they will know when it starts and when it ends, and then they can return the day after.
Okay. Just want to make sure that the individual says, they don't say, well, I didn't know when my suspension started or when it's supposed to stop, so I'm here, and kind of go in that circle.
It's a good question and a good point, and that's why on the library form, and I know that they will be using in parks, it's a box very big in the center saying start date, end date, so that they know, and it says, and it says you cannot return to these facilities.
Now, the individual that was served a suspension, if they happen to come back to a park, and I know that this suspension will be for all the parks within the city limits, and if they were to be on a particular park, but they were not encountered by any of the city staff or PD, and they happen to be on the park, and I happen to observe that person on there, and I call, who would I need to call to say, you know what, Mr. So-and-so is on the park from what we know. He was suspended for 30 days. That 30 day hasn't been up yet. And what exactly what happened to that individual because city staff didn't observe them being on the park grounds, PD didn't observe them physically being on the park grounds. Is there any mechanism that the city attorney may have?
Not necessarily the city attorney, but the Parks Department would receive that call, and then they could, in their tracking system that hopefully will be set up, they can definitely follow up and send out a notice in case, they can follow up, investigate, and then determine, whether it warrants a second suspension. And similarly, it can come to our office, and, as I mentioned earlier, we would do an investigation too, and we can always file a trespass action as well, depending, if it's a very strong case and there's good evidence on it. Our office can always do that too.
Okay.
President Wu, is your question, does the person making the observation of the the bad behavior or the violation of the rules has to be a park representative or a police representative. Is your question if it's a citizen, could the citizen make the observation, and would that observation count towards the application of different levels? Is that your question?
Yes, so if it wasn't the PD or if it wasn't the city staff.
So if it's like a citizen's
Yes,
report,
private citizen.
would that still count?
It still can count, and again, we would have to evaluate. If it's a criminal action, obviously we're held to the same standard as a felony. We have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. So we have to make sure that the evidence that was presented is the witness. Maybe it was more than one witness, more than one citizen. We have to take that into account whether we can really prove our case. But the same thing applies. I mean, the staff can evaluate that. As far as the suspension, they don't have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. They have to, it has to be reasonable, has to be maybe a preponderance of the evidence suggests that they violated, the rule or the stay away exclusion. But it definitely can be taken into account.
Okay. Thank you. Any other comments?
I do have one more consideration for staff. With the private security patrols that are patrolling the park, I would like to see a clarification of their role as far as issuing warnings or suspensions.
President Wu, Commissioners, I would be reluctant to give any authority to the private security company. Their role and responsibility is very specific. In addition to park facilities, they have a contract citywide, and so they have patrol responsibilities for other non-park facilities and other departments. They patrol only in the evenings. They close the parks and then they leave. But I think that would be adding another layer that we probably don't need as long as we have our police department. And I'm not sure how that would affect the liability of a private company versus a Glendale employee or their fee schedule.
To clarify my point was not to grant them authority to, but just to be able to have policies and procedure of what they would need to do if they were to come across someone drinking in the park, of whether they would need to call PD, whether they would need to get a park supervisor involved. I just wanted to have that, since this is an administrative document, to have that detailed with the private security.
Yes, Mr. Duran, if I may, Commissioner Michaels, President Wu, and members of the Commission, in our current contract, we do ask, there are post orders, very detailed explanation of their duties and responsibilities, one of which is if they do run into unruly behavior within the parks, they're supposed to contact the police department and ask the police department report on the suspicious activity, the individuals involved, the park, the location and time. They actually log all those activities, and they do share with us on a monthly basis the general logs. Now, if there's something very specific to a violation occurring, they'll contact PD, they'll notify us the following day as to the activities. So that has very clearly been communicated to our security company. And as far as their current responsibilities, as Mr. Duran mentioned, it is patrolling of our parks, locking, and reporting on these unruly behavior. We feel most comfortable letting our police department address these types of behaviors.
I simply wanted to get a little more clarification of the private patrol seeing kids climbing in trees, which would be a level 1 offense, and obviously they would issue a warning to not climb in the trees, and if they complied, I just wanted a better understanding of sort of the smaller gray area minor infractions of how they might be handled and who would have authority to do that.
We can discuss that further, but on a general basis, they will be given these rules and regulations. They have an understanding, and they can warn people doing things they shouldn't be. Explanation of these are the park rules, or you're not supposed to be doing that. For example, when they get to a facility and there's a group of individuals hanging in a parking lot, their first note is, "Hey, folks, we're going to be locking up the park. It's after hours. Please, disperse." In most cases, people have been, generally complying. In some cases, they don't comply. They give them a little bit more time. They tour around the park, make sure the rest of the park is clear, and that they're still there. That's when they call PD for the additional level of enforcement. But yes, on a general basis, they will inform people of the activities not being what the park should be intended for.
I just didn't see a mention of the private patrol in this document, and I just wanted to have that clarified.
That's a very good point, President Wu. We can provide a summary of the private security company's role and responsibilities at the next commission meeting, and clarify it. And it just occurred to me, maybe there is a way to give them the responsibility of being a third-party observer of a violation of rules that might be able to count towards the accumulation of the different levels that could lead to a suspension, now that I thought about it. So we could do a follow-up at the next meeting.
Okay, thank you.
I actually had one more. Sure. I think it goes along the lines of same as the reserving one table, the overcrowding on page 4. Line H. Technically, it's the same concept of, there's food on one table, everybody's using the park, and then, if technically that table was for 4 people, but people are just picking up things or singing happy birthday around that table, that means it's overcrowding, right? I just want to make sure that it's, I know what the intent of that line is, I just want to make sure that it's not being misused in the other form, so.
We'll go back and look at it with legal and see if there's a way to clarify. Otherwise, it will be
I know it is
discretion.
I mean, it's still defined as, technically if there's, 4 or 6 people can sit around that table, and then, there's 12 people singing happy birthday, and then. Thank you.
I just want to take a quick minute to thank the staff and Lieutenant Gilkerson for being here, and Mr. Grant from City Attorney's Office giving us all those insights. I just ask that, I know that it's still in the early stages, and there's going to be some clarifications, there's going to be some additions that's going to be made. If we could be mindful and sensitive to the various cultures that we do have in the community. I know that sometimes it does come into play because of the various culture, immigrant lifestyle. So I just wanted to see if we could go ahead and be mindful and sensitive to that as well. So it doesn't seem like heavy-handed to our residents and our community that this is well-intended type of policy, not to be just out there to enforce and to make their time at the park miserable and there's Big Brother type of thing. I just wanted to make sure that if we could kind of be sensitive to that, that'd be great.
That's a good point.
Thank you. I know that this is an action item, so it calls for a motion to review and approve. At the present time, would the commission feel comfortable?
With all the recommended changes,
Yes,
so how would this
So I wanted to ask
work?
how
Yes.
to address that.
President Wu, members of the commission, we will tweak the identification of the rules further. We will work with our city attorney's office and clarify them, particularly the ones that were pointed out today. We will further develop the specific communication that will be planned to take place between Commissioners in the Parks Department, Police, and the City Attorney's Office as it relates to establishing that centralized database that we can share in as real time as possible. We will compare the role and responsibilities of our private security company and if they might have a role in all of this, and inform the Commission. We will make sure that we are sensitive to the different cultures and maybe even include a sensitivity statement as part of as a preamble to the rules, and we will come back with a report summarizing that, and we will build in a 6-month evaluation with metrics as part of the implementation plan, and we'll come back with a follow-up report further elaborating on these things, if not January and in February. Our original plan was to have this before you in time for this past summer. But as I mentioned earlier, it took a lot of work on the part of all three departments and going back and forth and trying to think of every conceivable part to it. So now, hopefully, we're ahead of the schedule for at least a summer of 2016, because the summer is the peak time in which this will become a very valuable tool to really help out the police department. And by helping them, they're helping us. So we'll be back in January or February with a more refined implementation plan. But if we can have approval for us to proceed, that generally you're comfortable with this direction, then we will, your approval would be appreciated, and we can go ahead full-fledged to begin to make plans to implement this new suspension policy.
With the recommended changes?
Yes, we will come back with the further tweaking of the rules as identified today. And I think we all took notes on which those were.
If I could just clarify, there were two parts to the action. The first one is approval of the enforcement of rules and regs, which is basically the various levels and the levels of offense. So the 1 day, 30 days, 6 month, 1 year suspension. So that if you can approve that today, that's basically the suspension policy, and then we'll go back and further refine the actual rules and regulations. So those would be the two action items today. Is the first one was review and approve the enforcement of rules and regs, which is the actual suspension policy, and then we'll be back with the implementing some of the feedback or further reviewing the feedback received from Commission today and addressing the rules and regulations, which is the second half of the Exhibit 2 of the policy.
Well, I move that we approve the enforcement of the rules and regs and the various levels of enforcement as you've outlined them, with the tweaks and changes that Mr. Duran's outlined.
Okay, I will second it.
Commissioner Sasatrian?
Yes.
Wad?
Yes.
Kafayan?
Yes.
Michaels?
Yes.
President Wu?
Yes. Thank you. Next item, please.
Next is 7. Yes, 7, reports for information only. At A is Civic Auditorium Annual Report. This is continued from 11/16/15 meeting.
Again, President Wu, we weren't planning on making oral presentations on these reports. If you would like us to, we can. Or if you have questions, we're, of course, available to answer any questions you might have. We just try to keep it light for your sake and deference of your time.
That's fine with me.
Any other comments from the... I think that's okay with everyone on the commission, so how should we do this then?
So if I'm understanding correctly, the commission doesn't have any questions regarding these reports submitted for items 7A, 7B, 1, 2, 3, and 4, or 7C. Is that correct?
Right. Correct.
Then in that case, adjournment would be next on the agenda.
Can I, before you...
Sure, please.
The calendar items that you had mentioned in the beginning of the meeting, is there any way that, especially the teen nights and so forth, we can publicize on social media more often so folks are actually aware of and disseminate it to the community groups so there's more activity and more people out actually at these events?
Sure. Yes, President Wu, members of the commission, Commissioner Satrian, I believe that they are on Facebook, Twitter. They're also advertised in our newsletter, but we'll definitely make sure that they continue to be, and we'll maybe evaluate how often they are.
Maybe even on the individual events, sending out notices to the community organizations and asking them to disseminate that.
We will discuss that with the staff. Thank you very much.
Do we have any reports on the Rose Parade, where we are?
President Wu, Commissioners, the float is being built. I was there last week. The decorating, I think the decorating begins in terms of the flower decorating begins the day after Christmas. So they are recruiting volunteers now. It looks very nice. It's going to be a very nice float. It's larger than the normal size for Glendale. There is a reception sponsored by the Glendale Rose Float Association on December 28th at the Phoenix Rose Palace on Raymond Street in Pasadena. If you get on the Glendale Rose Float Association website, you can get more direction and buy tickets. They are looking for donations. I think they've sold all of their riderships. They have 14 riders, so they're successful in that. And it's coming along very nicely. I think you'll be very proud.
Where are we with the budget? Are we on the...
I don't have the latest report on how much, how much has been raised by the association. The goal was, I think, $50,000. Yeah, the goal was $50,000, and I think that's still their goal. And I know they're more than halfway. Last report we got, it was over $25,000, and that was a couple of weeks ago.
Just to add to that, the float will be displayed on Brand Boulevard as well. So it'll come back to Glendale on January 3rd and will be there till January 5th. So it'll also be on display in Glendale on Brand Boulevard for those who'd like to see it in person.
Brand and where, do you know exactly?
Right in front of the Alex Theater.
Okay. Great. So before we adjourn our last meeting of 2015, I would like to just thank the viewing audience and the city staff and our commissioners for a well year of 2015 meetings and all the issues and items that we were able to address. And I would like to wish everyone a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And I look forward to seeing everyone next year. Meeting adjourned.
Christmas.